A man walked into a bathroom while being filmed for a documentary and forgot his microphone was still recording. What he said next sounded like he was talking about a murder. At that point, he had already denied everything for years. His wife had disappeared and was never found. A close associate had been shot in her home, and he had admitted to killing another man, but walked free in court. Each case raised questions, but none had resulted in a conviction. There was always something missing, until that recording, because this time it did not sound like a denial. The first case began in 1982 in New York, when Kathleen Durst, the wife of Robert Durst, disappeared. Kathleen was a medical student in her final year, close to becoming a doctor, and her sudden absence immediately conflicted with the life she was building. Before she vanished, friends had described serious tension in the marriage, including arguments, fear, and concerns about Robert's control over money. On the night she disappeared, Kathleen was reportedly upset when she appeared at a friend's gathering before returning toward the home she shared with Robert. Robert later claimed he put her on a train at Katonah Station so she could return to Manhattan. But there was no confirmed independent sighting proving that Kathleen actually boarded that train. He also claimed she later called him from their Riverside Drive apartment, but that call could not be clearly verified as coming from Kathleen herself. Another strange detail followed when her medical school was told she was absent, even though it was unclear who actually made that call. These gaps mattered because they created a timeline that depended heavily on Robert's version of events. Investigators could not prove what happened after Kathleen's last confirmed contact. No body was found, and there was no physical evidence strong enough at the time to prove a murder charge. So Robert Durst was not cleared by certainty. The case remained unresolved because investigators could not prove what happened inside that missing window. The next major event took place in 2000 in Los Angeles, when Susan Berman was found dead inside her home. She had been shot once in the back of the head, execution style, inside her living room. Susan Berman was not a random victim. She had been a close friend of Robert Durst for years. She had also acted as a spokesperson for him during the investigation into Kathleen Durst's disappearance. That role mattered because she was one of the few people who knew details about how he had explained events in 1982. In the days leading up to her death, investigators were preparing to reopen questions around Kathleen's disappearance. This created a situation where Susan Berman was likely to be contacted again about what she knew. Shortly before her body was discovered, police received an anonymous letter directing them to her address. The envelope contained the word Beverly, spelled in an unusual way. Years later, that spelling would become critical when it was compared to known writing connected to Robert Durst. At the time, however, investigators did not have enough direct evidence to charge him. But this case created the first clear link between a death and a communication that pointed directly toward him. In 2001, the case took a different turn when Robert Durst was living in Galveston, Texas, under a false identity. He had rented a small apartment and was posing as a mute woman to avoid being recognized. This was not a temporary disguise. He had been living this way for months while distancing himself from earlier investigations. In the same building, he became acquainted with his neighbor, Morris Black. What led to the confrontation between them was never independently established. According to Durst's own account, Morris Black entered his apartment and a physical struggle began. Durst claimed that during that struggle, the two of them fought over a handgun. He stated that the weapon discharged during that struggle, killing Morris Black. There were no witnesses to confirm how the confrontation started or how the struggle unfolded. After the shooting, Durst did not contact authorities or report what had happened. Instead, he cut up the body and placed the remains into bags that were later found in Galveston Bay. At trial, because the prosecution could not disprove his version of the struggle beyond reasonable doubt, he was acquitted of murder. By this stage, investigators were no longer looking at isolated events, but at 3 specific incidents involving the same individual. In 1982, Kathleen Durst disappeared, and there was no body or physical evidence proving what happened inside the home. In 2000, Susan Berman was shot in her house, and an anonymous letter directed police to her address. That letter contained the spelling Beverly, which would later match writing connected to Robert Durst. In 2001, Morris Black was killed, and Durst admitted to the killing, but claimed it was self-defense. Each case involved direct proximity between Durst and the victim at the time of the event. However, each case also lacked one critical element needed for conviction. In Kathleen's case, there was no body and no forensic evidence establishing a crime scene. In Berman's case, there was no immediate proof linking the letter to Durst at the time. In Black's case, the prosecution could not disprove the self-defense claim beyond reasonable doubt. This meant that although the same individual was connected to all 3 events, none of them resulted in a conviction. It also meant that the investigation had evidence pointing in one direction, but not enough to legally establish guilt until new connections were made later. Years later, filmmakers began working on a documentary series examining Robert Durst's history and the cases connected to him. Durst agreed to participate and gave on-camera interviews about the events, including the disappearance of his wife and the death of Susan Berman. During the production process, the filmmakers obtained a copy of the anonymous letter that had directed police to Susan Berman's home in 2000. This letter had been sent to the Beverly Hills Police Department and included her address written on the envelope. While reviewing Durst's personal documents during filming, they also came across an older envelope that he had written himself. When the 2 envelopes were placed side by side, they showed multiple similarities. Both used the same unusual spelling of Beverly, which was not the standard spelling for that location. The handwriting style, spacing, and formation of letters also appeared consistent between the 2. This comparison became critical because the anonymous letter had directly led police to the scene of Susan Berman's murder. When Durst was confronted with this comparison during the interview, he acknowledged that the handwriting looked similar. This was one of the first times that physical evidence directly connected him to a communication linked to a murder scene. From that point, the investigation moved from separate suspicions towards a more unified and evidence-based case. During the filming of the documentary, Robert Durst was interviewed on camera about the evidence, including the matching envelopes. At one point, after being shown the matching envelopes, he paused and asked to take a break. He left the interview area and went into a bathroom, still wearing the microphone used for recording. The microphone remained active and continued recording. Believing he was alone, Durst began speaking quietly to himself. In that recording, he referred to the situation he was facing and the pressure around the case. He spoke in fragmented sentences, including phrases that suggested awareness of what had happened. The statements were not part of a formal confession given to investigators. However, they were interpreted as reflecting his own internal account of events. When this audio was later reviewed, it became one of the most significant pieces of evidence in the case. After the documentary brought new attention to the case, authorities moved to act on the accumulated evidence. Robert Durst was arrested in 2015 in connection with the murder of Susan Berman. The case presented in court focused specifically on Berman's death rather than the earlier cases. Prosecutors argued that Susan Berman was killed because she had knowledge of Kathleen Durst's disappearance and could have been questioned again. Their position was that her death was intended to prevent her from speaking further about those earlier events. Robert Durst did not provide a full formal confession to the court about the murder. The recorded bathroom statements were presented as evidence, but they were not treated as a direct legal confession. Instead, the case relied on the combination of the anonymous letter, the handwriting match, and the recorded audio. The court accepted that this combination established his involvement in Susan Berman's murder. In 2021, he was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. The disappearance of Kathleen Durst was later officially classified as a murder, but no separate conviction was obtained. The killing of Morris Black remained legally classified as self-defense, leaving only one conviction across all three cases despite the broader pattern.